Hi, my name is Stephanie Drumheller. I'm a vertebrate paleontologist and taphonomist at the University of Tennessee Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. And I specialize in how organisms interact with one another, sort of in between death and burial, and the types of traces that organisms leave behind on the bones that will eventually become fossils. So, several years ago, I was contacted by Dr. Clint Boyd to come up and look at a fossil with bite marks on it that he was initially a little bit mysterious about until I finally hammered out when I was going to arrive. And then he said, "Well, I have a dinosaur mummy, but it has bite marks on it." And that immediately got my attention because the traditional understanding of how dinosaurian mummies form involves extremely rapid burial because the idea was if anything interrupted the remains, especially things like predators or scavengers, then that would be sort of the end of the story. You wouldn't be able to get preserved soft tissue in this way. You wouldn't get a dinosaur mummy. Maybe you'll get other kinds of fossils, but you won't get that nice skin preservation. So having bite marks on skin sort of flew in the face of that initial description, but I tend to look at a lot of bite marks, so I was already very interested. I wanted to come out and see what this was going to look like. And I will admit that most of the fossils that I work with tend to be on the uglier side of things. They tend to be a little bit beat up, a little bit chewed on often. But showing up and seeing this beautifully preserved animal with skin that you could see in 3 dimensions was a bit shocking, I suppose. It was not what I was used to working with. It was really bizarre for me. And it took me a little while to get my bearings. But eventually, get in, start looking at the soft tissue, start looking at the damage that everybody at North Dakota had already recognized. And it became really obvious that, yes, absolutely, what we were looking at was some type of carnivore damage to one of the arms and to the tail of this animal. And at that point, I became nervous for a completely different reason because I was also familiar with the forensics literature. So, obviously, bite marks can be studied in a paleontological context, but there are plenty of reasons why anthropologists might be interested in them as well. And on the forensic side of things, this is often related to trying to identify human remains in a medical legal context. And there's an extensive literature out there about why bite marks on soft tissue are really bad and should not be used in a medical legal context because soft tissue tends to deform. So if you have any decomposition or any healing, that's going to warp the shape of the bite, and that's not going to let you know who exactly left it there. So I knew that bite marks on soft tissue were problematic, but people were really wanting me to identify who the trace maker was. And we lucked out a little bit because, yes, we had bite marks in the soft tissue, which was cool and bizarre by itself, but we also had some on bone. And obviously, bone is a lot more rigid, it's a lot more solid than soft tissue. So when you have teeth that impact into it, it tends to preserve the shape of the tooth a bit better. And from those bite marks on the arm, at least, we were able to figure out that it was some type of crocodiliform, so a distant croc cousin, that was at least damaging that part of the mummy. But while we were teasing all of that out, at the same time, I kept sort of sneaking over to other parts of the lab and looking at one of Dakota's feet, which did not have bite marks on it. And I feel like that everybody on the team was sort of shooing me back. They're saying, "Oh, you don't need to look at that. Come over here, look at the bite marks instead. That's what you're here for." But I kept coming back to the foot because it seemed familiar to me. So these animals would have been exceedingly large, and in life they would have had a fleshy pad on the underside of their feet to distribute weight. So think about something like an elephant foot. But the fossil that we were looking at didn't have a big fleshy pad preserved. It had this almost empty puddle of skin, like an emptied out balloon that was just draped across the foot and then spilled out to the side. And I realized that I had seen that kind of deflation again in the context of forensics research, where things like micro and mesopredators would come in and open up a hole into the skin because skin is not usually what carnivores are after. They're after the tissue inside. And then they would start removing soft tissue from the inside of the carcass. Once you've done that, once you've compromised the body wall, then all of the unpleasant gases and fluids and sort of microbial activity associated with early stages of decomposition, all of that has an escape route to get out of the remains. So what ends up happening is all of the internal tissues, all of the internal organs, the muscles, stuff like that, will decompose and leave through those openings in the body cavity, and the leftover skin that will be deflated and left behind, and it sort of unintuitively can promote mummification even in fairly dry environments. So this was our first inkling that we really needed to look a little bit more at the forensics literature if we wanted to understand how this mummy formed, because our traditional idea of this thing had to have been almost instantaneously buried at the time of death wasn't really holding up. We were looking at something that obviously predators and scavengers had interacted with it. We were looking at something that would have had to be exposed for an extended period of time so that it could undergo those stages, early stages of decomposition, and all of those internal tissues would then decompose and then leave behind this empty sort of envelope of skin. So, looking back at that literature, it became a lot more obvious that even though in paleontology, we've traditionally looked at carnivores as this destructive agent that's going to prevent soft tissue preservation, in reality, if you have partial consumption of remains, that can kind of unintuitively lead to this style of mummification that we call desiccation and deflation in the paper that came from this study. The compromised body wall allows for all of those soft tissues to go away, leaving behind just the dermal tissues, which is oftentimes all we're seeing in many of these mummified remains. So this was a new explanation for how mummies can form. A deep dive into the literature also made it kind of obvious that this is not the only mechanism by which mummies can form. And part of our problem is we've been trying to shoehorn all of these very different fossils into the same explanation. And really, there are multiple pathways that you could end up with something that we might call a mummy. And Dakota is one really fantastic example of desiccation and deflation, this far more common mechanism for drying out soft tissues so that at least some of them can be stabilized at the surface before burial. But it's certainly not the only path. And that's opened up all kinds of fun new research for the entire Dakota team.